She said, if something ever happens to me, make sure they look at Josh.
He was cornered.
Hi, Susan. We haven't seen or heard from you. We hope nothing tragic has happened.
Welcome back to another Facebook Live Q&A with the Cold team, by which I mean primarily Dave Cawley. Hi, Dave.
And you, Becky.
Thanks. Peripheral part. It's all about you right now. I thought we should maybe just acknowledge at first why you have on a red tie and why I am wearing an obnoxious red dress today is, in fact, Go Red for Women Day. And here at KSL, the American Heart Association's Go Red movement is actually kind of important to us. But to me personally, my mom died of heart disease when she was 59 years old. And my son was about a year and a half old. So he doesn't remember her. And he was actually almost exactly 2 years to the day older than Charlie. So this podcast has also linked in my mind some of these domestic violence issues that we've been talking about. So before we ask any other questions, Dave, I just wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind kind of going over with us some of those domestic violence warning signs that maybe don't look traditional and would surprise people. Because one thing that I've learned listening to your reports is that Susan was abused, even if she didn't know it.
Right, absolutely. The manipulation and control, I think, are the biggest things. And I know we have a lot of people who are jumping into Cold now for the first time. They're listening, binging from episode 1, so they're hearing this stuff fresh. Where, you know, we've, those of us that have been listening from the beginning, we're now several months into it, and some of that's in the rear view a little bit because we don't see Susan so much anymore in the story. Financial control, you know, exerting unnecessary control over finances. Obviously, however married couples establish their own money in their own household is their business, but when you have one person who's domineering of the money to the point where, you know, the other partner is not able to buy food, that's a problem. When you see, you know, the person who's breadwinning putting a check into account that person doesn't have access to, that's potentially a problem as well. Cutting off access to friends and family, that, you know, isolation from the support network, the verbal put downs, constantly, you know, belittling the partner. There are a lot of these things that you saw happen with Josh and Susan that from the outside, friends, family members were witnessing or were hearing about, maybe bits and pieces and maybe not the whole story, but they certainly were getting an idea that there was real trouble in this marriage. And many people gave advice, counseled Susan that she ought to divorce Josh, that she ought to leave. We know Susan did actually look at doing so, went in so far as talking to a divorce attorney at some point, but never did actually follow through on some of that. And it's an important reminder, I think, that when we hear people that we know about expressing some of those similar kinds of fears or talking about the ways in which they're not in control of their own lives because of, you know, that domineering behavior by a domestic partner, it's something that we all need to take seriously, and we need to do everything we can to provide help and counsel.
Yeah. For anybody who happens to follow Cold's social accounts on Twitter and on Facebook, we're at the Cold Podcast. We actually posted some resources with the hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, that I think were really instructive for me anyway. I don't know about you.
Absolutely.
Just in helping spot patterns and go, oh, okay, abuse doesn't just have to be a bruise.
Right.
It can look a lot different.
And I'll tell you, I mean, for myself, this is something of an evolution for me in when I started doing my research for Cold, I was studying Josh and Susan Powell. And when I started to see some of these patterns develop, the ways in which Josh acted and how that played into how he treated Susan, and in talking to, you know, her family and her friends who were saying, hey, we saw these warning signs, it's changed the way I view domestic abuse and the way I talk about domestic abuse, and that's a process that's ongoing. And I think that's hopefully what Cold can help do, is generate that conversation, get us all thinking about how do we approach these problems, how do we individually take action to prevent something like this from happening again.
Yeah, because this is absolutely as important an issue to be talking about as heart disease. So that's why we're here.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Talk to me about this past episode, episode 12. A lot of stuff with the FBI.
Yeah.
You and I have talked sort of off the record about that. They weren't able to get anywhere with the computers?
Yes and no. So you have a lot of different computers that were taken in this case, and I kind of brushed over, like, I mean, you've got computers from Josh's house, you've got computers from Steve's house, you've got cell phones, you've got hard drives, you've got thumb drives, you've got cameras, you've got all these devices that are taken at different points in the case, and there's kind of a first stop for all of those, which is the FBI's Computer Forensics Laboratory here in Salt Lake, the Intermountain West RCFL as it's called, and they did data extraction on a lot of different devices. A lot of what people have heard in the podcast so far is actually the result of stuff that was found on those computers. So, stuff like Josh's audio journals, those came off of his computers. And we're using all of that information that was scraped to help paint the picture of this relationship from many different angles. Josh's perspective, Susan's perspective from her journals and whatnot. But there was a portion of that data that was encrypted, and particularly if you go to our website, thecoldpodcast.com, and look at the episode 12 page, there's a photo of that drive that they found in Josh's basement office that was just connected to his computer, and the whole thing was encrypted. And it's been years now that people have been trying to break through that encryption, and they just have not been able to do so.
I had one tweet I noticed in particular just expressing some surprise, I guess, at the idea that even the FBI and the Secret Service really couldn't get through that.
Yeah, it's a harder thing than I think a lot of people understand to crack an encrypted device, especially when you have a long, sophisticated password like we know Josh Powell used. If you're not using kind of the common things that we all tend to use with passwords, a child's name, a significant date, something that can be easily guessed, in other words, or variations thereon, it becomes much more difficult. And they just are to the point where if there's not a kind of a backdoor, you hear the FBI talk about wanting a backdoor for like iMessage on Apple devices or something, so that they could go in and just view those. Then they're stuck having to do what's called brute force, where they're just basically guessing as many passwords as they possibly can as fast as they can, and that effort so far has just not gotten to the correct string of characters for Josh's drive.
And where most of us probably have an 8 or a 10 or even a 12 character password, how many characters are we talking?
Yeah, so Josh in 2011, around the time, actually it was probably the day that they served the search warrant at Steve Powell's house in August of 2011, Josh told the police at that time that he was using a 50 plus character password, and that at the time Susan disappeared in 2009, it was like 25. Somewhere in that neighborhood. So, if you're using a 10 or 15 digit password, think about, doubling that. That gets you into the neighborhood of where Josh Powell started. Double that again, and that's where he is, because, in 2011, he's obviously worried about police taking his computers again, so he's using a more sophisticated password.
Yeah. All right, we have some questions from some listeners.
Mm-hmm.
Amy Allen wanted to know, after all of the research and demented, deranged, and twisted findings, how are you holding up?
I'm getting that question a lot more now that people are seeing Steve Powell's, depravity exposed to a certain degree. I'm doing okay. I'm to be perfectly frank, I'm getting a little exhausted just because the pace of an episode a week is tough. I will tell you that I was working on something that's coming up for episode 14 last night, and everybody else had left. It's late here at KSL. It's quiet. I got my headphones on. I'm listening to a clip of an interview, and I got a little emotional, and so but I'm doing okay. Thanks for asking.
Okay. Crystal Pickering wants to know if they are still working on Josh's hard drive or if they've stopped and just determined that it's never going to happen.
So West Valley City Police, this is outside of their area of expertise. So they've shopped it out. We talked about they sent it to the FBI, to the Secret Service. To give you kind of a peek behind the curtain, the company that makes the software that the FBI was using at the time, this FTK Forensic Toolkit software, they're actually based here in Utah. The company's called Access Data. And a number of people that are former employees there, as far as I understand, they started their own company called Decipher Forensics. And in, I want to say, 2013, West Valley Police gave them a copy of that encrypted drive and said, have at it. And Decipher has been working on that when time has allowed and resources allowed over the last number of years. I've heard through the grapevine that they're still continuing to work on that. I also noted in a story for the Deseret News this week that the West Valley provided another copy of this drive to a cryptography expert who works for Intermountain Healthcare. They didn't send the drive to Intermountain Healthcare, but this is somebody who in their free time said, hey, why don't you let me take a stab at it as well? So multiple efforts are ongoing as far as I know on that front.
Peter Larson wants to know if you're going to do another podcast after this one because he wants more. He wants more.
Yeah.
Do you get a break first?
Well, we'll see. It's great to know so many people are listening to Cole. I mean, I'm blown away every day to know that there are that many people out there who are following Susan's story. Some who saw it in the news and followed originally. Some who had never heard about it. I would love to do another podcast when this is done, but this has the entirety of my focus right now, and I don't know how long that's going to last, quite honestly. So hopefully yes, but we'll see where it goes.
Jolene Wilson asks, where was Josh's mom through all of this?
So Josh's mom, Terry, was living with Jennifer in Utah, West Jordan, when Susan disappeared. And as far as I know, she was there through most of what happened in kind of the primary case. Terry and Jennifer had a bit of a falling out, and you'll hear why in episode 13 next week, shortly before Josh killed the boys. And since that time, has maintained a very low profile. So I've had a chance to speak briefly with Terry, where she's living now. It's not something that I think needs to be blasted out on the internet. But she's been primarily in Utah with, the occasional visit up to Washington while this was happening.
Did anyone associated with the podcast try to reach out to Steve before he died?
Yes. I, in fact, wrote a letter to Steve while he was still incarcerated up in prison in Washington State, where he was serving time for the child pornography charge. Jumping ahead a little bit, Steve actually did 2 terms in prison. One was voyeurism, and then they actually retried him because in his original trial, the child pornography case was tossed out on a technicality. So, long story short, Steve was in prison. I sent him a letter, introduced myself, explained what the podcast was about, and expressed my desire to come up and speak with him. I never heard back from Steve. He never wrote me back. It wasn't long after that he was released from prison, and he was a registered sex offender at that point. So I had an idea of where he was living based on the sex offender registry. During a trip to Washington, I actually staked out his place for a while, just hoping that I might, A, confirm that he was living there, and B, get a chance to approach and, introduce myself. Never did see him, so I don't know if he was even living where his address was listed at that time. And then because he was, as I understand it, he was kind of back and forth a little bit to the hospital and things when his health started going down. I wasn't able to find a good contact phone number. All the phone numbers that we had for Steve were prior to his serving time and no longer worked, so I was not able to connect with Steve, but we did make as good an effort as we could.
Sure. Kelly Lee, how many times during your investigations and research do you say, what the what, at the things that you find?
quite often, but not maybe as often as you would think, because some of this stuff I've known for a while. As a reporter following the case as it unfolded, yeah, that happened a lot. And then researching for Cold, it became more a case of putting the pieces together, so getting a sense of what was happening, behind the scenes. I will tell you that, in episode 11, when we discussed Operation Tsunami and how all of those pieces were part of a larger plan, we had reported on the search in Ely, we had reported on the honk and wave, we had reported on the search warrant service at Steve Powell's house. But then seeing the operational plans and noticing, this is something that West Valley was cooking up months ahead of time. And there were other pieces that we didn't report because they never actually acted on those. But they were brainstorming some other ideas for that. That I was, of course, it all makes sense when you see it planned out, but when I was in the weeds of covering that as it happened, event by event by event, you didn't necessarily see how they're all tied together. So, that's one example. Certainly reading Steve Powell's journals, that was a constant case of what?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Courtney Anderson wants to know, have they questioned the other brother and sister after their dad and brother passed away? So I think we're talking about John and Alina.
John and Alina. Not that I know of. So John, we've discussed in prior Facebook's Live. I don't know what the proper plural is there, but
attorneys general,
right,
whatever.
Right. I don't know that they've spoken to them. Alina had some contact with West Valley Police as the case was going along. They came to the house quite often. They were usually there to talk to Josh or Steve, but Alina was often present. She was there when they served the search warrant at the house and had some conversation with the police lieutenant at that time. There's nothing that I've seen in the police case file that suggests they were ever suspicious of Alina herself. And if a police officer wants to talk to you and you say, I'd rather not talk to you, unless they're going to go get a subpoena to force you to speak to them, or, you have a right to not talk to the cops.
It's right there in the Miranda rights.
Right. And so, and with John Powell, there are some, mental health issues that come into play that I think basically left the police thinking that there was not much to be gained by speaking with John.
Sure. One thing that we were talking about before is there are a number of things that people will put on our Facebook page or send us an email about or tweet to us. Has anybody ever looked at this thing that I heard about? St. George came up, Vernal came up, there was a supposed hotel sighting, there was a gas station sighting. Speak to me a little bit about why you haven't specifically addressed some of those sightings of Josh in the first 24, 48 hours after Susan disappeared.
Yeah, that's a great question. When you look at a tip, and West Valley Police received hundreds of tips, and they ran the gamut from, hey, I'm somebody who personally knew Susan, and she told me this in an email, right? That's a high value tip. And then you have somebody who says, hey, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I think I saw Susan at a diner. Doesn't really fit with what we know of the case. That's a low probability tip. There were a number of tips, though, that dealt with sightings of Josh, specifically, as you pointed out, that first kind of 24, 48-hour time period, or maybe a few days ahead of time, somebody saw something suspicious out in the desert, and they called the police and said, you ought to know that I saw this or that at this location. If that couldn't be verified, our standard is we don't want to be spreading information that is not factual. And it's not to say that the people who reported these didn't see the things that they saw. It's that we can't definitively tie them to the case. So I intend to spend an episode talking about some of these leads and what the police did to chase them down. But you'll notice that I don't give a whole lot of weight to some of them simply because even if they might be true, there's simply no way to go out and factually verify that, that the person who saw Josh at such and such place really saw Josh and not somebody who maybe looked like Josh.
Right.
Yeah.
Pamela Hansen still wants to know if the West Valley Police helped prepare Jennifer Graves for when she wore the wire and questioned Josh in Washington. After listening to the episode, it sounds like nobody prepared her on how to successfully interrogate him. Did they send her up there with any training?
Training might be a bit much, but they definitely briefed Jennifer. This was a plan that actually came from Jennifer. It was her idea. And she was the one who approached the police with it, and they executed it pretty quickly after she came up with the idea. I mean, the time span there is just a little more than a week from when she comes up with the idea to when she's actually up there doing it. And so when she got to Washington, she did meet with Pierce County Sheriff's Department and West Valley Police staff, and they talked about how this thing was going to go forward. But, those police officers, they didn't know Josh better than Jennifer did. I mean, this is Jennifer's brother. And she's going into the house with her other siblings and with her dad, who she knows far better. I think this is January of 2010. So the police are just getting to know the Powells. Jennifer probably had a better sense of how to talk to Josh than any police officer did at that point. And I think what you hear in that recording is that when she makes that appeal, to Josh, tell me, I'm your sister, it doesn't register with him at all. So, and that's why you hear Ellis at the conclusion of that say no one was going to break Josh. I mean, if your own sibling coming to you and putting you on the spot that way emotionally doesn't register, what are the police going to tell you that's going to be any better?
Yeah. Another question from Jocelyn Larson. Steve accused Susan of absconding with a lover, that's her word, I love it, in his journals and in interviews, but the talk about murder-suicide in the last episode seemed to suggest that he had an inkling of what Josh was going to do. Do you think Steve knew the details? Were there any hints in subsequent songs or writings about what that might have been?
I don't think Steve had any foreknowledge of what happened to Susan. I don't think he had any active part in what happened to Susan. There's nothing in, songs that he wrote that suggests he foresaw any violent end. I mean, his songs are all, people have heard his songs.
Yeah.
But by the way, I need to point out, we are done with Steve Chantry songs. They are out of the podcast from here on out.
Thank you.
Yeah. But there are some very revealing journal entries that Steve wrote that were not included in the original release of the police case file that I now have my hands on and will be including in future episodes of the podcast that give you a very clear sense of, yes, Steve was under no illusions on December 7th and 8th, 9th, the first few days, that Susan was likely dead and that Josh was likely responsible. And he said as much, and we'll go into that.
But he didn't know ahead of time, as far as you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Casey Baldes? I don't know. Apologies. Have you ever talked to the sheep herder about the place where he saw Josh and the time to kind of back up any of that information?
Sure. I have not, no. So let's talk about why that is. At the beginning of this week, very early Monday morning, I was actually out on the Pony Express Trail trying to verify some information that I was preparing to report in episode 12.
Wait, doesn't everybody go hang out there in January?
Oh, December, January, it's a great time.
Right.
Nobody out there, except for the sheep herders. And so I camped actually on the west side of Dugway Pass, not far from the turnoff to the Dugway geode beds. And about a half mile away was a sheep herd camp. And when I woke up in the morning, several hundred sheep were munching their way up along the Pony Express Trail. The sheep herders run the sheep there on winter range during the winter, but these are people who are somewhat, well, first of all, there's a language barrier. Most of them are migrant workers, and I don't speak any other language than English, so there would be a bit of an issue there. And I don't know that they would be the same, sheep herders this many years later. I don't know how many different sheep herding operations there are out there. Suffice to say, the information that the police got was that this one sheep herder that they talked to that first week said they saw a light blue minivan going west on the Pony Express Trail near Simpson Springs at about 11 a.m. on December 7th. They saw it returning the opposite direction sometime around, like 2, I want to say, without looking at my notes, I want to say that it was about 1 or 2 o'clock. So that gives you kind of a radius from that point based on how far you could drive in that time and come back. And that was the information that the police used.
Cassie Carlson is asking, the boys mentioned they went to Dinosaur National Monument. Why didn't West Valley Police investigate that area?
Yeah, so Charlie talking about Dinosaur National Park, as he called it, when you stop and really watch that interview with Charlie and hear the way he talks, it's pretty clear to me that what he was doing was just mashing together all of his memories of camping. We know that in March of 2009, Josh had taken the boys out on the Pony Express Trail for what turned out to be a failed overnighter. We know that in May of 2009, Josh, Susan, and the boys went out to Fish Springs and the Dugway geode beds, and what I've come to learn was a place called the Solar Wind Claim, where they posted some photos and things. In August of 2009, they did go to Dinosaur National Monument over near Vernal. They also went to Thanksgiving Point and their dinosaur museum around that same time. So when Detective Kim Welty sits down with Charlie and says, well, tell me about, you went camping, tell me about camping. Charlie starts talking about, we went on an airplane to go to Dinosaur, and then we went to the beach. And he's clearly not talking about what he did the night or the day before. He's talking about all of these other places, and it very well could be that when he's talking about crystals, he is talking about being out at the Dugway geode beds the prior May, not what happened a day or two before. And that's kind of the read that the police took too. Originally, when you hear him say that in the moment on December 8th, it's something that they immediately take and confront Josh with that information. You see Josh go, that's not true. If he said that, that's not true. Josh isn't concerned. I know Ellis Maxwell, the lead detective, when he went back and actually watched that Charlie interview, he came to the same conclusion that, Charlie's not talking about what happened yesterday. He's just mashing all this stuff together. So that's, I think, explains why you didn't see an active police search over in Vernal near Dinosaur. I can also tell you that it's an area where you see a lot of natural gas mining, but you don't see hard rock mining where you would have the type of mines that we talk about in the West Desert, where you have shafts and things like that are hundreds of feet deep. Right.
Did police ever go to St. George?
St. George comes to play in this story, but not for the reason you would think. They went there, or at least communicated with police in St. George to try to verify what Steve Powell was suggesting with the Stephen Kocher tip. So, we mentioned that when Steve pitched it to the FBI. Again, I'm going to go into a little more detail in an upcoming episode about, the police did want to see if that was a possibility based on the information that Steve provided. They weren't down there, though, just, checking mines or things like that in that area, because there was nothing in evidence to point them that direction. And this is something that, I think you have to look at what was likely for Josh to have done, not just what was possible for Josh to have done. Could he have driven to St. George and back in the time that he was gone? Yes. But that would have been driving down there and almost straight back. It would have meant stopping for gas along the way and risking, having somebody see you and later come forward and say, hey, what are you talking about? I saw Josh Powell, in Beaver or Cedar City buying gas. that's a long drive on a highway when you've got a winter storm blowing through. Some of those, stretches outside of Scipio and stuff wouldn't have been a fun drive. So there was nothing to suggest that he had been down there, which is why I don't think you saw any active searches around St. George.
Sure. Are you going to talk about the caseworker's 911 call?
Yeah. In fact, we'll be playing that tape as part of the episode where Josh commits the murder-suicide of the boys, and it's still so hard to listen to. And for people who have not heard it before, you'll have probably a hard time, because it's
gut-wrenching.
It's so bad. It's so hard. And this is something where we can learn from how that went wrong, and we'll talk about that.
Okay. Do you listen to podcasts?
Yes, I do. Not a lot of true crime, which might seem funny to people since I make a true crime podcast.
But there's a method to that madness, I bet.
There is. Yes, I don't want to be copying anybody else's ideas, good or bad. I kind of set myself in isolation from some of that. What I actually like to listen to, I'll be perfectly honest with you, we have some, and this is going to sound stupid, but we have some other great podcasts in this organization, in KSL, that I like to listen to. My friend Cleon Wall does one on Utah Jazz called Jazz Notes that I listen to. Cox and Friends, Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox here in Utah has a podcast that he does. I listen to that. We've got a great health focused one called Really Healthy that I like. I listen to some tech ones. I listen to one called Daring Fireball that's by a blogger named John Gruber who talks about Mac stuff. I listen to some photography podcasts. So yeah, I'm a pretty avid podcast listener.
Cool. Question we actually get a lot, surprisingly. People wanting to know, what are you listening to? Okay, so to go back to Steve for just a moment, this is from Jamie Gonzalez. So Steve did admit he was previously worried about Josh hurting Susan, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah. You hear that in those journals going back into especially 2008, when we know from Susan's writings that the marriage was really at its probably lowest point. Susan at the time was writing to friends in emails talking about how she was afraid of Josh, and that she might have an accident riding her bike to work. Steve says the very same thing, and he actually there's one journal entry where Steve talks about Josh wishing that Susan would have an accident, and that that he dreams of police showing up to his door and saying Susan was hit by a car. When you take those two things together, it certainly suggests that there was some conversation happening between Josh and Steve, and maybe between Josh and Susan to that effect. And that might explain part of why she felt the fear that she did, that he might be, planting the idea in her mind of, you're going to have an accident.
Going way back here, this is from Brianne Noyes. She wants to know if you feel that Susan maybe planted the phone in the console, which is why Josh was surprised it was there, or if it was just an oversight of his.
That presumes that Susan was conscious in the van with Josh on that night. It presumes that Josh was lying when he said that he had simply borrowed the phone to take some numbers out of it and forgot that it was in the console. I will tell you that the fact that the SIM card was missing from that cell phone suggests pretty strongly that Josh knew it was there, and that he was the one that put it there, because Susan would not, in my mind, have taken the SIM card out of her own phone before planting it in the center console of the van.
From Ben Anderson, how much did the police go deep in checking Josh's spending, especially for the camping supplies, when he withdrew from an ATM, etc., before and after Susan's disappearance?
Sure. The camping supplies that he had in the van, I don't think he bought those right before they were on that trip. Susan in 2008, in the summer when she's making her DVD of their assets, she talks about them having camping supplies in the garage. We have photos of them doing s'mores in the backyard of their home long before they went on the winter camping trip. where those marshmallow roasters are visible. So I think he had those for a while. The police did use a number of search warrants and subpoenas to pull Josh's financial records. They looked at his credit cards, they looked at his bank account, and there was nothing definitive in there except for, because I've had my hands on some of these same records now, I will tell you one interesting thing, and this is actually the first time that I'm reporting this, so if you're watching the Facebook Live, you're getting new information. When Josh took the rental car on December 8th and left Salt Lake City International Airport, you heard me in that episode say, what Josh did next will probably never be known. I can safely tell you now that what Josh did next was drive to West Valley to his bank, and he did a cash advance against his credit card, and he took about $600 out of the bank. And then he went wherever he went. So they looked at that. They obviously weighed that when you consider, is that suspicious? That you leave the police headquarters, you go get a rental car, and Josh told his family, hey, I just drove around the streets of Salt Lake for 18 hours and 800 miles. Why do you need $600 in cash to do that, untraceable cash? It's a good question.
Yeah. Second part of the same question, what about camera footage to help Coroner Josh establish where he was?
Yeah, same story. The police went and actually tried to pull any surveillance they could. They knew, based on some of the electronic surveillance they did, putting the GPS tracker on the van, some of the common routes that Josh drove, some of the places that he tended to stop, where he tended to go get gas, that kind of thing. And they did go to those stores and try to pull surveillance. There was nothing that was really there. I've seen a lot of people ask, what about traffic cameras? Working in a newsroom, I've had my eyes on UDOT, Utah Department of Transportation traffic camera feeds for a long time. I can tell you that at night, especially in bad weather, you might be able to see headlights or taillights, but you're not going to be able to see, who's in a vehicle, sometimes even what the make and model of the vehicle is, what the license plate of that vehicle is. And I don't know how much of that even gets, automatically archived. So there's not a lot that they really could glean from going back to look at, say, traffic cams. Business surveillance was a better shot, but it just didn't lead them anywhere.
Sure. Jamie Gonzalez, does it frustrate you as much as it does her that we will not have an answer specifically from Josh himself?
It's frustrating, certainly. Josh had several opportunities to speak his mind to law enforcement, to family, to the public. Before he took his own life and killed his boys, he sent messages and emails to several people, to his sister Alina, to Dax and Mindy Guzman, who were renting his house in Utah, to his attorney. And all he basically said at the time was that he wasn't able to go on and he was sorry, goodbye. Why didn't he, if he knew anything at that point, why didn't he say anything? Well, I don't know. Only Josh knows what was in his mind at that time, and why he didn't speak more candidly with the police at several opportunities along the way. So it would have certainly been nice for Josh to have spoken more clearly and plainly about what he knew or didn't know about what had happened to Susan. He rejected his opportunities to do that, and my being frustrated with that at this point doesn't help anything.
MJ wants to know, have there been any searches in Oregon? I heard there was a lead her dad followed a bit ago.
Yeah, there were a couple searches in Oregon. One actually right along I-84 outside north of Ontario, between Ontario and Baker City, and I'll get into that. That's going to come up when we start talking about Michael Powell in the podcast pretty quick.
Coming very soon.
Yep. And there was another search, and it was basically the last big search before this case was declared cold. That was over at a property that Steve Powell's sister and her husband were living at over in Glens Mills. They brought in cadaver dogs and they searched that property on the thought that maybe Josh had visited there. As a big wooded property, and they didn't find anything there either. We've talked a couple times in the podcast now about this idea of Rattlesnake Rock. Michael, making a snide comment to Josh about don't search near Rattlesnake Rock. The police actively looked for places with rattlesnake in the name up around Idaho, Oregon, and I know had talked to local law enforcement up in Oregon about some of those areas as well.
Brian Pearson wants to know, what in the end do you think was the final tipping point for Josh killing Susan? Do you think he discovered the emails about divorce?
Josh, so let's assume, because there is a degree of assumption here, right? Based on the available evidence, let's assume Josh killed Susan. If that's the hypothetical we're making, I have to ask, what was the question? What was the reason? What was the motive? Was the motive that Susan told Josh, I'm leaving, and I'm leaving on this date, and you'll never have the kids again? That's possible, but I think there's a strong case to be made that there was a lot of premeditation that was taking place. So if you are talking about life insurance, power of attorney, creating the trust, this all happened long before Susan disappeared. If Josh expected that he was going to at some point collect on the life insurance, then whatever that tipping point was probably happened like a year and a half before Susan died, maybe even before that. Josh didn't seem to love Susan much at all, especially those last couple of years of their marriage. And the idea of Susan leaving him, I think he would have been happy to have her gone. What he wasn't going to tolerate, from everything we know, was Susan taking the boys. So if there was some kind of, quote unquote tipping point right there in early December of 2009, I have to imagine that's what it was.
Ann Johnson wants to know, how much do we know about where Michael was when Susan went missing and during the gap of time, 18 hours, that Josh went off the grid?
Obviously not as much as we would like to, but more than I think has previously been disclosed. And this goes back to some of the records that the West Valley City Police Department obtained using search warrants and subpoenas. They did go back once Michael Powell started kind of registering on their radar a little bit more. After Operation Tsunami, when they're doing the wiretap on Josh and Steve Powell's phones, they're overhearing Josh and Michael talk in a way that clearly suggests these two have shared knowledge, that Michael maybe knows more about what happened to Susan than anyone had previously thought. They, at that point, start actively pursuing more information about where Michael would have been. Most of what we know, though, actually comes from Steve Powell's journals, because he, those first few days, is writing about, this is what Mike and Alina and myself were talking about at the house. So you can clearly put Michael in Puyallup in that time frame. We know that Michael and Alina left to come to Utah to support Josh on December 12th, and have kind of a good idea timeline that wise. So it's a bit of a work in progress for me, still trying to lock in some of the specifics about where Michael could have gone, where he was, but we're painting a pretty good picture.
Timothy Adkins wants to know, which piece of evidence is the most convincing to you that Josh killed Susan, and which piece do you believe was most convincing to police?
Thanks for the question, Tim. I think the police very early on, when they discovered Susan's last will and testament in her safe deposit box, Ellis Maxwell told me that they kept that very close. They didn't disclose that they had it to anyone or that it even existed for a very long time, because he believed that had they gone to trial with charges against Josh for the murder of Susan, that would have been kind of their dynamite evidence. And you can see why. I mean, you put that in front of a jury. Here's Susan in her own words saying that she's afraid of her husband, that if something happens to her, police need to look at Josh. Please don't let her kids go anywhere than other to her parents. That's pretty compelling. That's pretty compelling evidence. For me, when I started on this investigation, I tried to check my own personal conclusions and start fresh. And doing all of the reading of Steve's journals, of Josh's writings, listening to his audio journals, reading all of Susan's emails, all of this, it really becomes not one single piece of evidence, but more a constellation of everything that we know. And the fact that I've not come across any other viable explanation for Susan's disappearance. So those two things together, in my mind, combine to suggest that Josh killed Susan. I've talked to a number of people who were unconvinced and were trying to maintain an open mind, who have said that once Josh killed the boys, even though that's not direct evidence that he killed Susan, it removed any doubt in their mind that he was responsible.
Christine is asking how much of the money was given to the Powells through the life insurance.
It's
complicated.
It is complicated, and I don't have that right in front of me. I can tell you, generally speaking, that what happened was after Josh died, Michael and Alina made claims against his life insurance. The life insurance company, looking at everything with changes to the trust, and Michael trying to, Josh trying to cut out, Chuck Cox as a trustee in place of Susan. It's got very complicated, and they went to a federal court and in essence said, whatever we do in terms of giving this money out, we are going to get sued. So we would really appreciate the federal court being the one that decides where this money goes, not us. And that played out. Michael took his own life before that was decided, and Michael was determined to be a beneficiary, and so a lot of the money ended up in Michael's estate. A lot of it ended up in Susan's estate. It was almost, if I recall, it was almost a 50-50 split that way, but I would have to go back and check the records to be sure.
Okay. We're running out of time, but I do want to squeeze in one last question here, which is from Chad. What does tomorrow, next week, next month, next year look like, knowing the information that you have today?
In terms of me or the investigation, I'm not sure. I understand the question.
I'm assuming meaning the investigation in cold. So what do you do now based on the information you have right now?
Right. Well, I mean, I mentioned earlier in the Facebook Live here that, Monday morning I was out in the desert checking on a location. I'm not somebody who suggests that we all need to run out into the desert right now and start, looking in holes or anything. I think that what happens from this point on is it needs to be targeted. So there needs to be a reason to go. If we're going to go search someplace, there needs to be a reason why. So what I'm doing is continuing to go through some of the more technical records, the stuff like the bank records, the phone records, looking for anything that I didn't pick up on my first or second or third pass through a lot of this information. If there's something that stands out that needs to be pursued, if it's something I can do myself, I'm going to do that. If it's something that I feel like needs to be reported to law enforcement, I may do that. There are people who certainly I would have liked to have talked to include their voices in the podcast where it makes sense. The next few weeks, we're going to get as many more perspectives to include in our story. We at some point will obviously reach an end to releasing episodes. At that point, I would like to really take a bit of a break, clear my mind a little bit, and then identify what are some of the questions that I have that have still not been answered. Are there any avenues to investigate those, and then go back to work on some of that stuff? That might take, anywhere from a few weeks to several months. And it might mean that we come back with some additional episodes based on if there's anything to report. Ultimately, when I started this podcast, I was well aware of the fact that there's a hashtag that Susan's friends have been using since the very beginning, which is Find Susan. And that's a call to action. But I've also come to realize, at least for myself, that Find Susan isn't just talking for me about physically locating Susan Powell's remains. as a reporter covering the story of Susan Powell, I didn't know her. I was, I never met her in real life. I didn't know the kids. And in doing the research, in some way, I feel like I've found Susan in that, to me, she's a real person. And I know who she is, what mattered to her, why so many people cared about her when she disappeared. So finding Susan and helping other people find Susan and recognizing that her example has power, those are, I think, pretty important for me going forward.
Okay. Well, let's stop it there. We'll try and squeeze more of these in as we go along. We're also trying to respect Dave's time, though, and I know you've got a lot of work to do.
Well, it's a good problem to have, and
Yeah.
so grateful for everybody that's listening and sending questions. Thank you.
Thanks.